Somewhere in Sparta, 300 women waited for husbands who would never return. August 24th, 480 BC, a narrow pass called Thermopylae, the Hot Gates. 300 Spartan warriors stood in formation. The sun was rising. It would be their last. Behind them, the immortals of Persia descended from a mountain trail. In front of them, tens of thousands more Persian troops prepared the final assault. There was no escape route, no reinforcements coming, no strategy left except to sell their lives as slowly as possible. King Leonidas, 60 years old, stood at the center of his men. He had spent his entire life preparing for this morning. Every Spartan they were not here to win. They were here to buy Greece 3 days. 3 days for the Greek fleet to reposition. 3 days for Athens to evacuate. 3 days to turn panic into resistance. The mission was simple. Die slowly enough that it mattered. They had already held for 2 days against the largest army the ancient world had ever assembled. They had killed thousands. They had made the King of Kings bleed. And now, surrounded. On all sides, they would make their last stand. Not behind their defensive wall, but advancing into the wider pass where the Persians could deploy their full numbers. This is not a story about victory. This is a story about 300 men who chose certain death over retreat and in doing so became eternal. If this story stays with you, drop a like. It helps others find it. Now, let me take you back 20 years to the moment an empire decided Greece must burn. 490 BC, 20 years before Thermopylae. By this point, the Persian Empire had already achieved what no civilization in human history had managed. It had consumed the known world. Under Cyrus the Great and his successors, Persia devoured Babylon, the city that had once built towers to touch heaven. Egypt, ruled by god-kings for 3,000 years, now sent grain shipments to Persian governors. Lydia, whose king Croesus had been the wealthiest man alive, was reduced to a footnote in imperial tax records. The empire stretched from the Indus River in the east to the Ion Sea in the west. 10,000 tribes speaking 100 languages, all bowing to one man. The system was efficient and brutal. Keep your gods, keep your customs, keep your local leaders, but you will pay tribute. You will send your sons to fight in Persian wars. And if you resist, you will be erased. The word superpower did not exist. Yet, but if it had, there would have been only one candidate. And then in 499 BC, a collection of Greek trading cities on the western coast of Anatolia, collectively called Ionia, made a catastrophic miscalculation. They rebelled. These cities had been Persian subjects for decades, prosperous but resentful of foreign rule. When they rose up, they sent messengers across the Ion Sea to the Greek mainland, begging for help. Most cities refused. The Persian Empire was too large, too powerful, too far away to provoke. But Athens, a young democracy that had only overthrown its own tyrants a generation earlier, agreed to help. Athens sent 20 ships against an empire that could field armies of 100,000. It was a token gesture barely worth noticing. But those 20 ships crossed the Aegean, landed in Ionia, and joined the rebels in a daring raid on Sardis, the regional Persian capital. They burned it to the ground. When news reached King Darius the Fern at his palace in Pepololis, he was holding court with hundreds of officials and foreign dignitaries. He listened to the report in silence. Then he asked a simple question. Who are the Athenians? An advisor explained. They were Greeks, a democracy, a city where common citizens, farmers, merchants, laborers voted on matters of state. Darius, who ruled 46 nations as the living representative of the god Ahura Mazda, found this concept so absurd he laughed. Then he called for his bow. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, Darius took an arrow, aimed it at the sky, and prayed aloud, "Zeus, grant me vengeance against the Athenians." He released the arrow and watched it disappear into the heavens. Then he gave an order to his servants. At every meal, 3 times repeat the phrase, "Master, remember the Athenians." Darius did not forget insults, and burning Sardis was more than an insult. It was a declaration that some insignificant city-state believed it could defy the empire and survive. The Ionian revolt was crushed with methodical efficiency over the next 5 years. Persian armies moved through the rebel cities like a flood. By 494 BC, the revolt's heart, the city of Mettus, was surrounded, besieged, and finally stormed. Every adult male was executed. Every woman and child was sold into slavery. The city itself was leveled so completely that later travelers could barely identify where it had once stood. The other rebel cities surrendered or were destroyed in turn. But Darius had not forgotten the 20 ships. In 490 BC, he assembled a punitive fleet, 600 warships carrying perhaps 25,000 soldiers. The mission was simple: cross the Ion, burn Athens, and remind the Greek world what happened to those who defied Persia. The fleet island hopped across the Aegean, accepting surrender from dozens of Greek cities that saw no point in resisting. When they reached the island of Eretria, which had also supported the Ionian rebels, they besieged it for 6 days before traders inside opened the gates. The Persians burned Eretria and enslaved its population. Then they sailed for Athens. The Persian fleet landed at Marathon, a coastal plain 26 miles northeast of the city. The Athenians had perhaps 10,000 hoplites, citizen soldiers, most of whom were farmers who had drilled a few times a year. The Persians had superior numbers, cavalry, and the experience of conquering half the world. What happened next violated every principle of ancient warfare. The Athenian general Miltiades made a decision that seemed suicidal. He ordered his hoplites to charge, not advance, charge at a full sprint in heavy armor across a mile of open ground directly into the Persian lines. The Persians, accustomed to their enemies, who kept their distance and traded arrows, were stunned. The Greek phalanx, a wall of interlocking shields and spears, crashed into their center before they could properly deploy. The Greek wings, reinforced at Miltiades' command, wrapped around the Persian flanks. It was over in hours. 6,400 Persians died on that beach. The Athenians lost 192 men, each one later honored with a name carved in stone. The Persian fleet retreated. Across the Aegean, Athens erupted in celebration. Temples were built. Hymns were sung. The impossible victory was treated as proof that the gods favored Greek freedom over Persian tyranny. Playwrights would write about Marathon for generations. Parents named their children after the battle, became the defining moment of Athenian identity. But Marathon was not a victory over Persia. It was a receipt for a bill that would come due. Darius began preparing a second invasion immediately. Not a punitive raid this time, but a full imperial conquest. He would bring the entire weight of the Persian war machine, crush Athens, and incorporate all of Greece into the empire where it belonged. But in 486 BC, 4 years after Marathon, Darius died. His son Xerxes inherited the throne of the largest empire on earth. He also inherited the sacred obligation of vengeance. Xerxes was not content with punishing Athens. He would finish what his father started. He would bring all of Greece under Persian rule, ensuring that no barbarian democracy would ever again dare to burn a Persian city. For 4 years, the machinery of empire turned toward war. Messengers rode to every corner of the Persian domain with orders. Send troops, send ships, send supplies. Infantry units assembled from 46 nations. Cavalry arrived from the steppes. Engineers were dispatched to solve logistical problems no army had ever faced. The Hellespont, The narrow strait of water separating Asia from Europe was over a mile wide. Xerxes ordered his engineers to build 2 pontoon bridges across it, each constructed from hundreds of ships lashed together with wooden planks laid across the top. When a storm destroyed the first bridges, Xerxes gave an order that demonstrated both his absolute power and his fury. He commanded that the Hellespont be whipped 300 times and branded with hot irons for its insolence against the King of Kings. The bridges were rebuilt to avoid the coastal storms that had destroyed part of the 490 BC fleet. Persian engineers spent 3 years digging a canal through the Aos Peninsula, cutting a waterway wide enough for 2 warships to pass side by side through solid rock and earth. By 480 BC, the preparations were complete. Herodotus, writing A Generation, later claimed Xerxes assembled an army of over 1 million fighting men, supported by an additional 2 million servants, camp followers, and support personnel. Modern historians consider this impossible, but they still estimate the Persian force at somewhere between 80,000 and 200,000 combat troops, supported by a fleet of 600 to 800 warships. The exact number in the end did not matter. What mattered was that in the spring of 480 BC, the largest military force ever assembled in the ancient world began crossing from Asia into Europe. It took 7 days and 7 nights for the entire army to pass over the bridges. Greek spies watching from the hills reported that the columns stretched beyond the horizon, that the army drank rivers dry as it marched, that when it made camp, it looked like a second landscape had appeared overnight. Tens of thousands of tents covering the earth in every direction. City after city in northern Greece surrendered without resistance. Messengers arrived offering the traditional tokens of submission. Earth and water symbolizing that the land and everything on it now belonged to Persia. Those cities were spared. The cities that refused to submit were annihilated, its populations massacred or enslaved, buildings burned, the ruins left as warnings. By summer, Xerxes had advanced through Thrace, through Macedonia, into Thessaly. He was 3 weeks from Athens. Most Greek cities began preparing their own surrender, but 31 cities sent representatives to an emergency meeting at the Isthmus of Corinth. Out of hundreds of Greek city-states, only 31 were willing to discuss resistance. And what they were about to discover was that resistance might not even be possible. The 31 delegates who arrived at Corinth in the summer of 480 BC represented cities that had almost nothing in common except geography and language. Greece was not a country. It was not a nation. It was a collection of independent city-states, police, scattered across the mainland, islands, and coastlines of the Ion. Each one governed itself. Each one considered itself superior to its neighbors. And most of them had been fighting each other for centuries. Athens was a radical experiment, a democracy where even poor citizens voted in the assembly on matters of war, peace, and policy. To most Greeks, this system was borderline insane, letting farmers and fishermen decide foreign policy. It was mob rule, dressed up as governance. Sparta was the opposite, a militarized oligarchy where a small warrior elite ruled over a massive enslaved population. 2 kings ruled simultaneously. A council of elders held legislative power. The entire society existed to produce soldiers, and it showed Spartan hoplites were the most feared infantry in the Greek world. Corinth was a commercial powerhouse that controlled trade routes between the Ion and the Adriatic. Thebes was a land-based military power that had fought bitter wars with Athens over border territory. Argos, one of the oldest cities, still nursed grudges against Sparta from conflicts decades old. These cities shared the same gods, competed in the same Olympic Games, and consulted the same oracles. But they also maintained professional armies specifically to fight each other. Trade disputes turned into border wars. Border wars turned into generational feuds. Old alliances collapsed over insults, and new ones formed. based on who currently hated who most. The idea that they would unite against a common enemy was not just unlikely, it was almost unthinkable. And yet here they were, because the alternative was watching Xerxes burn each of their cities one by one. The debate inside that meeting hall was brutal. Athens sent a delegation led by Theisticles, a naval commander who had spent the last decade arguing that Athens needed to build a fleet. He had been right. Athens now had 200 warships, the largest navy in Greece. But ships could not stop a land army, and the Mysticals knew the Persians were coming for Athens first. Marathon had guaranteed that. The Athenian position was simple: fight now, fight together, or die separately. The Peloponnesian cities, Sparta, Corinth, Argos, saw things differently. They lived behind the isthmus of Corinth, a narrow strip of land that connected the Peloponnesian peninsula to the mainland. It was perhaps 4 miles wide at its narrowest point. Their proposal abandoned northern and central Greece entirely. Let Xerxes take Athens, Thebes, and everything else north of the isthmus. Then defend the Pelopines from behind fortifications at the narrowest point where numbers would matter less. The Athenians were furious. Abandon Athens, watch the Persians. Burn the city that had defeated them at Marathon. The smaller cities were terrified. They had no armies large enough to matter, no walls strong enough to withstand a siege. They begged the larger cities for protection, but offered little in return except promises and desperation. For days, the arguments went in circles. The strategic reality was crushing. The Persian army was too large to defeat in open battle. Greek hoplites were superior soldiers one-on-one. Better armor, better training, better discipline. But when you were outnumbered 10 to 1 or 20 to 1, individual superiority meant nothing. The Persians would simply flank, surround, and annihilate any Greek force that met them in the field. Worse, the Persian fleet outnumbered the combined Greek navy and could sail around any defensive position, land troops behind Greek lines, and turn every battle into an encirclement. There was no good option. There was only one option that was slightly less catastrophic than the others. A Spartan officer, his name lost to history, stood and pointed to a map. Thermopylae. The name meant hot gates, after the sulfurous hot springs that bubbled up from the ground near the pass. It was the natural choke point between northern and central Greece, the place where the Pindus mountain range descended almost vertically into the sea, leaving only a narrow coastal corridor. Any army marching south from the Sicily toward Athens had two choices: take the coastal route through Thermopylae or take a much longer inland route through difficult mountain terrain that would add weeks to the march and leave supply lines dangerously exposed. Xerxes would come through Thermopylae. It was the only option that made strategic sense. And at its narrowest point, the pass was approximately 50 feet wide, barely enough room for a single wagon. The Spartan officer explained the tactical situation. If a force held Thermopylae, the Persians could not use their numbers. They would be forced to attack on a front so narrow that perhaps 50 men could fight side by side, no more. Their cavalry would be useless. Their archers would risk hitting their own troops. Every advantage the Persians had in open terrain would vanish. It would not stop them, but it would delay them. And delay at this point was the only currency Greece had left. The Greek fleet could take position at Artemisium, 40 miles north by sea, and prevent the Persian navy from simply sailing around the pass. If both positions held, Xerxes would be stuck, unable to advance by land or sea. It would buy time for Athens to evacuate its population, time for the Peloponnesian cities to build fortifications at the isthmus, time to organize, prepare, and turn panic into coordinated resistance. The Congress debated for hours, but the conclusion was inevitable. Thermopylae was the only defensible position between Xerxes and southern Greece. The next question was simpler. but far more dangerous. Who would hold it? Every eye in the room turned to the Spartan delegation. Sparta had the only army in Greece capable of holding a position against impossible odds. Everyone knew it. The Spartans knew it. And after a long silence, the Spartan representatives agreed. They would lead the defense of Thermopylae. A Congress adjourned. Messengers were dispatched to every allied city with orders. Send troops north immediately. The combined Greek force would meet at Thermopylae within 2 weeks. But when the Spartan delegation returned to Sparta and presented the plan to their government, they encountered a problem no one had anticipated. The Olympic Games had just begun, and the Festival of Carneia, one of the most sacred dates in the Spartan religious calendar, was underway. Spartan law was absolute. During these festivals, the army did not march to war. To violate this law would offend the gods and bring divine punishment on the city. The Spartan assembly, the Gerousia, refused to send the army until the festivals concluded. It would take weeks. Xerxes would be at the mop long before then. The Greek alliance had a plan, a position, and a promise of Spartan leadership. But Sparta's army was not coming. And that was when King Leonidas made a decision that would define the next 3 days and the next 3,000 years. To understand Leonidas's decision, you need to understand Sparta. And to understand Sparta, you need to understand that it was not a normal city. It was a machine designed to produce one thing: warriors who did not fear death. Spartan society was built on 3 castes, stacked like layers of a pyramid. Each one necessary, each one brutal. At the bottom were the Helots, stay-toned slaves, who outnumbered their Spartan masters by at least 10 to 1. Most were the conquered descendants of Messenia, a region Sparta had subjugated generations earlier. The Helots farmed the land, produced the food, built the infrastructure, and lived in constant, suffocating terror. They were not just enslaved, they were richly humiliated. Once a year, Sparta formally declared war on the Helots, making it legal to kill them without trial or consequence. Young Spartan warriors proved themselves by hunting Helots at night, a practice called kripier, secret police operations designed to keep the slave population terrified into submission. The Helots hated their masters. They vastly outnumbered them. And every Spartan knew that if the Helots ever organized, ever rebelled in force, Sparta would drown in blood. Above the Helots were the Persioi, free men, but not citizens. They handled trade, crafts, and the economic functions that Spartan citizens considered beneath them. They could not vote, could not hold office, but they could own property and bear arms. When Sparta went to war, the Persioi marched alongside the citizens, second-class soldiers in a first-class army. At the top were the Spartiates, full citizens. Probably never more than 8,000 to 10,000 adult males in the entire city. And every single one of them was a professional soldier. They did not farm, they did not trade, they did not build or craft or manage estates. The Helots did that. The Spartiates had one job: war. From the moment of birth until the moment of death. Every Spartiate lived according to a system so extreme that even other Greeks who were comfortable with slavery, infanticide, and routine violence found it disturbing. When a Spartan child was born, it was not taken home. It was taken to a council of elders who inspected it under torchlight. Strong limbs, clear eyes, healthy cry. The infant lived weak, deformed, sickly. The baby was carried to a ravine on Mount Taygetus, called the Apothetai, the place of rejection, and left there to die of exposure. Archaeologists have found the bones. The child survived inspection. It returned to its mother. For 7 years, the boy lived at home. He learned to speak, to obey, to endure discomfort without complaint. Spartan mothers did not coddle their sons. There is a story, possibly apocryphal, but repeated for centuries, of a Spartan mother handing her son his shield before battle and saying, "Come back with this or on it." There was no third option. At age 7, the state claimed him. The the Spartan training system, was not education. It was transformation through pain. Boys were taken from their families and placed in barracks with others their age. They would live there for the next 13 years. They were given minimal clothing, one red cloak per year, regardless of season. In winter, they slept on reed beds. They had to cut themselves from the Euphrates River. They were not given knives to cut them. They were deliberately underfed. The rations were never enough. Hunger was constant, gnawing, inescapable. But stealing food was encouraged if you were smart enough not to get caught. If you were caught, you were beaten savagely, not for stealing, for incompetence. The lesson was clear. In war, you take what you need to survive, but if you fail, you suffer. They fought each other constantly. Organized competitions, yes, but also spontaneous violence that the instructors allowed, even encouraged. Broken bones were common. Deaths were rare, but not unheard of. Pain was the curriculum. Endurance was the grade. At age 12, the training intensified. The boys were formed into packs and sent into the countryside with no supplies. They had to survive on whatever they could hunt, steal, or scavenge. At night, they conducted cripire, hunting helots in the dark, killing them quietly, ensuring the slave population never forgot that rebellion meant death. This was not cruelty for its own sake. This was deliberate conditioning. Sparta was a small warrior elite sitting on top of a vast enslaved population that hated them. The only thing preventing constant revolt was overwhelming, relentless terror. The cripire kept the helots afraid. It also taught Spartan boys that killing was not extraordinary. It was Tuesday. At age 20, those who survived faced their final test. If they passed, they became full citizens, Spartiates. They received their armor, a bronze breastplate, greased for the legs, a Corinthian helmet that covered the entire face except for the eyes and mouth. And most importantly, they received their shield. The shield was not just equipment, it was identity. It was round 3 feet across, made of wood and bronze, heavy enough that carrying it for hours was its own form of training. On its face was painted the Greek letter lambda or Lecid for Lacedaemon, Sparta's formal name. And on the inside, every Spartiate knew the words that defined his existence. Idus epiton with it, or on it. Return from battle carrying your shield victorious, alive, unbroken, or return dead carried on your shield by your comrades. Dropping your shield to flee faster was the ultimate disgrace. It meant you valued your life over your duty, your survival over your brother's. A Spartan who returned without his shield was shunned, mocked, stripped of citizenship. His family was humiliated. His name became synonymous with cowardice. Death was preferable. Once accepted as a Spartiate, the soldier joined a Sisha, a military mess unit of about 15 men. He would eat every meal with these men for the rest of his life. They trained together, fought together, and judged each other constantly. If the group decided you were weak, cowardly, or unreliable, you could be expelled, which meant losing citizenship entirely. The bonds formed in these units were stronger than family. Your messmates were the men who would stand beside you in the phalanx shields overlapping, trusting you to hold the line while they held theirs. If you broke, they died. If they broke, you died, so no one broke. Spartiates married and had children. Producing the next generation of warriors was a civic duty. But they did not live with their wives. They lived in the barracks. They ate in the mess halls. Their lives belonged to Sparta, not to themselves. There was no retirement. A Spartiate remained a soldier until he was physically incapable of holding a spear or until he died in battle. Most chose the latter. This system was designed for one purpose: to produce hoplites who fought in perfect unison, who did not panic under pressure, who would hold formation even when the man beside them was dying. In the tight, brutal calculus of phalanx warfare, where discipline mattered more than individual skill, Sparta produced the best soldiers in Greece. But it came at a cost. Spartan birth rates were low. The AOG killed some boys and broke others. The constant warfare attritioned the ranks. By 480 BC, Sparta could field perhaps 8,000 Spartiates at full mobilization, a fraction of what Athens or Thebes could muster. But those 8,000 were worth 3 times their number. Every Greek knew it. Every enemy feared it. Leonidas was not supposed to be king. He was the third son of King Anaxandridas, which meant he was never meant for the throne. His older brother, Clemenus, inherited the crown. Leonidas went through the AUG like every other Spartan boy. No special treatment, no royal privilege. He was beaten, starved, and tested like everyone else. He survived. By 480 BC, Leonidas was approximately 60 years old, ancient for a soldier, but still capable. He had become king only 5 years earlier, after Clemens went mad and committed suicide under circumstances that remain murky even today. The throne passed to Leonidas, not because he was ambitious, but because there was no one else left. He was not a reformer, not a visionary, not a politician. He was a Spartiate who had spent 6 decades living by one rule: the state comes first. Always, and death in battle is the only honorable end. When the Spartan assembly told him the army could not march during the sacred festivals, Leonidas did not argue. When the other Greek cities sent desperate messages begging for Spartan troops, Leonidas did not make excuses. He made a decision. He would go to Thermopylae immediately, not with the army. That would violate sacred law, but with his personal bodyguard. 300 Spartiates, the royal honor guard. And here's the detail that every Spartan understood, even if Leonidas never said it aloud. He selected only men who had living sons. This was not random. This was not coincidence. Leonidas was choosing men whose deaths would not end their family lines. Men who had already fulfilled their duty to produce the next generation. Men who could die without leaving Sparta weaker. He was selecting men for a suicide mission, and every single one of them volunteered. Before he left, Leonidas went to Delhi, the sacred sanctuary where the oracle delivered prophecies from Apollo himself. He asked what the gods saw in Sparta's future. The oracle's response was unambiguous. Either Sparta would be destroyed by the Persians, or one of Sparta's kings must die in battle. Leonidas had spent 60 years preparing for this answer. He returned to Sparta, kissed his wife Gorgo goodbye, and gathered his 300. One of the Spartiates, a man named Dionysus, was told by a local that the Persian archers were so numerous their arrows would blot out the sun. Dionysus smiled. "Good Killaham," he said. "Then we'll fight in the shade." In early August 480 BC, Leonidas and his 300th marched north. They were not marching to win. They were marching to buy time with their lives. And they knew exactly how much time they had left. Leonidas and his 300 departed Sparta in the first week of August 480 BC. They moved north through the Peloponnese on foot, their red cloaks visible for miles. Helots' attendants carried supplies. Pyrrhoi soldiers marched alongside perhaps another 1,000 men who were not citizens, but would fight and die like them anyway. Word spread ahead of them. The Spartans were marching to Thermopylae. Other cities sent what they could spare. At Taea, a contingent of 500 hoplites joined the column. At Manta, another 500. At Orchomenus, 120. These were not the full armies of their cities. Those would stay behind to defend home territory if the Persians broke through. These were volunteers, men who understood they were marching toward delaying action that would almost certainly end in death. At Corinth, the columns swelled further. 400 Corinthians joined, along with 200 from Phlius, 80 from Mycenae. The wealthiest cities sent the most, the poorest sent what they could. No one sent their best troops except Sparta, which had sent its king. By the time Leonidas crossed into central Greece, his force numbered close to 7,000. At the city of Thespe, 700 hoplites joined without hesitation. Thespe was small, unremarkable, and directly in the path of the Persian advance. They knew their city would burn whether they fought or not. They chose to fight from Thebes, a city whose loyalty to the Greek cause was questionable. 400 hoplites arrived under the command of Leonidas. Some sources claim they were sent as hostages, forced to march with the Greeks to ensure Thebes didn't immediately surrender to Persia. Others say they volunteered. Either way, they came. Leonidas did not turn anyone away. The column reached the Mop in mid-August. For most of the soldiers, it was their first time seeing the place they would defend, and they immediately understood why they had been sent here. Thermopylae was not a battlefield. It was a geographic trap designed by nature, waiting for someone to spring it. To the south, the cliffs of Mount Calramos rose almost vertically, sheer rock faces that no army could climb in formation. To the north, the Malian Gulf lapped against rocks and narrow beaches. Between them ran the coastal road, the only practical route for an army moving south. The pass itself consisted of 3 natural choke points, gates where the mountains pressed, closest to the sea. The eastern gate was wider, perhaps 300 feet. The western gate near the town of Alponi was similarly broad, but the middle gate, where an ancient defensive wall still stood in ruins, was barely 50 feet across. This was where Leonidas established his position. The wall had been built generations earlier by the Phocians during one of the endless inter-Greek wars. It had crumbled over time, stones scattered, sections collapsed. Leonidas ordered it rebuilt. For 2 days, the Greek soldiers worked like laborers, hauling stones, stacking them, filling gaps with smaller rocks and packed earth. They did not build it high, perhaps 6 feet. Enough to create a barrier that would force attackers to climb over, exposed, vulnerable, easy to kill. Behind the wall, they dug shallow trenches and planted stakes. In front of it, they scattered colts, small iron spikes designed to horses and slow infantry. It was not sophisticated. It did not need to be. The wall's purpose was simple: funnel the Persians into an even narrower killing zone where the Greek phalanx would have every advantage. Leonidas stationed the Spartans at the center directly behind the wall. The other contingents would rotate in and out, fighting for a few hours before pulling back to rest while fresh troops took their place. This way, the men at the front would always be rested. The Persians would be attacking uphill into an unbroken line that never tired. It was a good plan. It would work as long as no one got behind them. Everyone knew about the Thermopylae path. Local Greeks had used it for generations. Shepherds moving flocks between pastures, hunters tracking game through. The high country merchants avoiding the coastal toll stations. It wound up the southern slopes of Mount Calidramos, traversed the ridgy line for several miles, then descended behind the Greek position near the village of Alpanio. The path was steep, treacherous in places, and took half a day to traverse, even for men who knew it well. An army trying to move along it would be strung out in a vulnerable column, unable to deploy for battle. But if that army reached the other side, the entire Greek position would collapse. Leonidas could not defend both the pass and the mountain path. He did not have enough men, so he made a calculated decision. He sent 1,000 Phocian hoplites to guard the heights. The Phocians were locals. They knew the terrain. Ate understood the stakes. Ate's her own cities lay just beyond Thermopylae, and if the Greeks failed here, Phocian lands would burn first. Leonidas gave them clear orders: hold that path at any cost. If the Persians get past you, we all die. The Phocians climbed into the mountains and made camp along the trail. From their position, they could see down into the pass and across the gulf to the north. They watched, they waited, and they trusted that when the time came, they would hold. 40 miles north by sea, the Greek fleet anchored off the coast of Euboea, near a place called Artemisium. 300 warships, most of them Athenian triumphs, long and fast, bristling with bronze rams designed to punch through enemy holes. The fleet's mission was straightforward: prevent the Persian navy from sailing around the landing troops behind the Greek position. As long as the fleet held, Leonidas' defensive line would be protected from a naval flanking maneuver. But the Greek fleet was outnumbered at least 2-1. If the Persians broke through at Artemisium, they could beach their ships south of Thermopylae, and the entire Greek army would be surrounded. Both positions depended on each other. If either failed, both failed. Messages passed between the two forces daily. Small boats hugged the coast carrying reports. No Persian ship sighted yet. No movement in the pass. Both sides waiting. But everyone knew the Persians were close. Scouts had been tracking their advance for days. The army had left Thessaly and was moving south through Trae. They would arrive at Thermopylae within a week, possibly sooner. On August 17, 480 BC, the Persian army appeared on the northern horizon. The Greeks on the wall saw it first, a dark mass in the distance, shimmering in the heat. Then closer and closer, and suddenly the northern plain was no longer empty. It was covered in humanity. Tents began appearing like a second landscape. Thousands of them, tens of thousands, arranged in neat blocks according to unit and nation. The Persians made camp with the efficiency of an army that had done this 100 times. Engineers marked out lanes, supply wagons rolled in. Horses were corralled. Cook fires began smoking. From the Greek position, it looked like a city had materialized overnight. Xerxes established his command pavilion on high ground with a clear view of the pass. From there, he could see the Greek position, a low stone wall, a few thousand men, banners fluttering in the wind. He did not order an immediate attack. Instead, he waited. For 4 days, nothing happened. The Persians did not advance. The Greeks did not retreat. The two armies sat within sight of each other, close enough that men on the wall could see individual Persian soldiers moving through their camp. The Greeks used the time to drill, rotating units in and out of formation, ensuring everyone understood their role. The Spartans combed their hair, long, elaborate grooming that seemed bizarre to the other Greeks, but was part of Spartan ritual before battle. If you were going to die, you died beautiful. The Persians, meanwhile, seemed to be waiting for the Greeks to come to their senses and flee. Why would a few thousand men stand against an army this size? It was irrational, suicidal. Xerxes sent scouts forward to observe. They returned with reports that baffled the king. The Greeks were exercising, oiling their bodies, preparing weapons with meticulous care. The Spartans were sitting outside the wall, completely exposed, calmly braiding their hair as if they were preparing for a festival, not a battle. Xerxes summoned Leonidas, the exiled Spartan king who now served as an advisor. What are they doing? Leonidas looked at the Persian king and spoke carefully. They are Spartans, my lord. They are preparing to die. When Spartans go to battle expecting death, they make themselves beautiful. It is their custom. Xerxes reportedly laughed. The idea that a few hundred men would groom themselves before being annihilated by the largest army ever assembled seemed absurd. But the Greeks did not leave. Day 1, Day 2, Day 3, Day 4. On the 5th day, Xerxes sent an emissary under a white flag. The message was simple: surrender your weapons. You may leave with your lives." The Greeks on the wall watched the emissary approach. He stopped 50 feet from the gate and shouted the offer in Greek. Leonidas stepped forward so his voice would carry. His response was 2 words: "Malin la, come and take them." The emissary returned to Xerxes and delivered the reply. The King of Kings stood in silence for a long moment. Then he gave the order every Greek soldier had been expecting since the moment they arrived. Attack. August 22nd, 480 BC, the first Persians to die at Thermopylae were me, infantry conscripts from the eastern provinces of the empire. Armed with short spears and wicker shields, Xerxes sent them forward in loose formation. Thousands of men advancing across the open ground toward the rebuilt wall. They came at a jog, not a run, conserving energy, staying organized. Behind them, more units waited in reserve. The plan was simple: overwhelm the Greeks through sheer weight of numbers. The Medes reached the wall and began climbing. That's when the Greeks killed them. What happened next was not a chaotic brawl, to a systematic butchery. The Greek phalanx was designed for exactly this situation: 8 ranks deep, shields overlapping edge-to-edge. The front rank presented an unbroken bronze wall. Their spears, 9 feet long, tipped with iron, projected forward in a hedge of points. The second and third ranks angled their spears over the shoulders of the men in front, creating multiple layers of stabbing weapons. The Medes climbed the wall and impaled themselves. Their wicker shields could not stop Greek spear thrusts. Their short spears could not reach past the Greek shields, and the wall itself forced them to climb in small groups, exposing them completely, while the Greeks remained protected behind their bronze wall. The first rank of Medes died in seconds. The second rank climbed over their bodies and died the same way. The third rank hesitated, and the Greek archers positioned behind the phalanx began loosing arrows into the packed mass of Persians. The Medes broke and retreated. Xerxes sent Sicians next, another subject, people from the empire's eastern reaches. They reached the wall. They died. They retreated. By mid-morning, the pass was littered with Persian dead, and the Greeks had not lost a single man. This is where Leonidas' planning paid off. Fighting in a phalanx was exhausting. The armor alone weighed 60 pounds. Holding a shield for hours caused muscle failure. Stabbing, pushing, holding formation in the summer heat. Men collapsed from exhaustion even without being wounded. So Leonidas rotated his troops. The Spartans held the line for 2 hours. Then the Tigans moved forward, and the Spartans pulled back to rest, drink water, eat dried meat, and recover. After 2 hours, the Mantineans replaced the Tigans, then the Corinthians, then back to the Spartans. The Greeks at the front were always fresh. The Persians attacking them were always tired. Wave after wave of Persian infantry advanced, fought, and either died or retreated. The survivors were exhausted. The replacements were fresh, but had to step over piles of their own dead to reach the wall. And waiting for them, every single time, was an unbroken line of rested Greek hoplites. It was a meat grinder, and the Persians kept feeding men into it. By early afternoon, the Spartans introduced a tactic that turned Persian aggression into a death sentence. They would suddenly break formation and retreat, not in panic but in apparent disorder. Shields lowered, men stumbling backward as if rooted. The Persians, seeing the feared Spartans fleeing, would surge forward in pursuit, breaking their own formation in their eagerness to chase down the enemy, and then the Spartans would turn. In an instant, the fleeing Greeks would snap back into perfect phalanx formation, shields locked, spears leveled, and the pursuing Persians would run straight into them at full speed. The slaughter was worse than at the wall. The Persians were disordered, breathless, overextended. The Spartans were calm, coordinated, and stabbing in rhythm. The Persians fell for this trick 3 times on the first day. By late afternoon, Xerxes was no longer amused. He had sent forward thousands of troops. He had watched them die or retreat in disarray. He had lost men without gaining a single foot of ground. Sitting on his throne overlooking the battlefield, Xerxes reportedly leapt to his feet 3 times in frustration. Each time his army broke and ran. The King of Kings gave a new order: send the immortals. These were not conscripts. They were the elite 10,000-man royal guard, personally loyal to Xerxes, equipped with the finest armor and weapons the empire could provide. They were called immortals because their number never changed. Casualties were immediately replaced, maintaining a constant force of exactly 10,000. They had never failed. Their commander, Leonidas, formed them up and marched toward the pass. The other Persian troops pulled back to make room. The Greeks on the wall saw the immortals coming, their distinctive uniforms, their disciplined formations, and understood this would be different. Leonidas called the Spartans back to the front. The immortals reached the wall and attacked with coordinated precision. They did not rush. They did not panic. They advanced, step by step, shields raised, spears thrusting in unison. For the first time all day, the Greeks were being pressed. The immortals pushed toward the wall, using their shields to deflect Greek spears, stabbing at gaps in the defense. They were professionals, fighting professionals. And for a brutal stretch of minutes, the line held by pure discipline on both sides. But the pass was still only 50 feet wide. The immortals could not use their numbers. They could not flank. They could not surround. They were funneled into the same killing zone as everyone else, and their superior training only meant they died more slowly. The Greek spears found throats, groins, armpits, anywhere the Persian armor had gaps. The men behind the immortals could not help because there was no room. The men in front could not retreat because their comrades were pushing from behind. After an hour of grinding, vicious combat, the immortals withdrew. For the first time in their history, they had been stopped by an enemy they outnumbered 10-1. As the sun set over the Melian Gulf, the fighting ended. The Greeks pulled back behind their wall. The Persians retreated to their camp. Both sides counted their losses. The Greeks had lost perhaps 200 men, most from exhaustion, some from wounds. A few killed outright when a Persian spear found an unprotected spot. The Persians had lost between 4,000 and 5,000. That night, the Greek soldiers ate cold rations, checked their equipment, and sharpened their spears. Some joked, some prayed. The Spartans sat in small groups, speaking quietly, their long hair still immaculate despite the day's fighting. Leonidas walked the line, checking on his men, offering words of encouragement. He knew what they had accomplished. They had held for an entire day against an army that should have crushed them in an hour. But he also knew this was only day one. In the Persian camp, the mood was darker. Xerxes summoned his generals for a council. The reports were humiliating. Thousands of casualties, no ground gained, the immortals repulsed. The Greeks were still in position, unbroken, apparently unshaken. One general suggested withdrawing and finding another route, acknowledging defeat and taking the longer inland path. Xerxes refused. He was the King of Kings. He commanded the largest army on earth. He would not be stopped by a few thousand Greeks hiding behind a wall. But privately, he was beginning to understand what the Greeks already knew. As long as they held this pass, numbers meant nothing. The Persians needed a new plan. And on the heights above the battlefield, 1,000 Phocian soldiers sat around campfires on the Thermopylae path, watching the smoke rise from both camps, unaware that their vigilance was the only thing standing between the Greeks and total annihilation. Tomorrow would bring another frontal assault. But somewhere in the Persian camp, someone was already asking the question that would decide everything. Isn't there another way around? August 23rd, 480 BC, the second day began before sunrise. Xerxes had spent the night receiving reports from his generals, and the conclusion was unanimous. A frontal assault through the pass would not work. Not today, not ever. The terrain made it impossible to exploit Persian numerical superiority. But Xerxes had not brought an army of 100,000 men to turn back at the first obstacle. If throwing more soldiers at the wall would not work, he would try something else. The Persians opened the second day with cavalry, horsemen from the steppes, light and fast, armed with bows and javelins. The strategy was to harass the Greeks from a distance, force them to stay behind their shields and create openings for infantry. To exploit, it failed within minutes. Horses would not charge into a wall of spears. The riders tried circling, loosing arrows as they passed, but the Greeks simply raised their shields and waited. A few arrows found gaps. One Corinthian took a shaft through the thigh and had to be carried back, but the phalanx held firm. When the horsemen got too close, Greek archers returned fire. 3 riders fell, the rest withdrew. Next, Xerxes ordered a sustained arrow barrage. Thousands of Persian archers formed up behind their infantry and began firing volleys into the Greek position. For 10 minutes, the sky darkened. The Greeks crouched behind their shields, protecting their heads and legs. Arrows clattered off bronze, thudded into wood, stuck in the ground like iron grass. A few men were hit through the foot, through the calf, one through the neck, who died choking on blood. But you cannot take ground with arrows. Eventually, infantry has to advance. When the Persian foot soldiers moved forward, the Greeks stood, reformed, and killed them. By mid-morning, Xerxes was ordering attacks simply to keep the pressure on, sending unit after unit forward. Not because he expected them to break through, but because stopping would look like surrender. Thracians came next, tribal warriors. From the northern edges of the empire, fierce and undisciplined. They charged the walls, screaming war cries, scrambling over the stones with axes and short swords. The Greeks killed them with the methodical efficiency of men harvesting wheat. Then came Sake warriors from the eastern steppes, experts in close combat, wielding curved swords designed for slashing. They fought with wild aggression, hacking at Greek shields, looking for any opening. The phalanx gave them none. By noon, the pass was carpeted in bodies, so many that the Persians had to drag their own dead aside to create space for the next attack. The Greeks rotated units as they had the day before. 2 hours on, 4 hours off, rest, water, food, back to the line. The system worked. The men stayed strong, and the Persians kept dying. From his command throne overlooking the battlefield, Xerxes could see the entire disaster unfolding. Every tactical advantage his empire possessed was useless here. His cavalry could not charge. His archers could not suppress. His numerical superiority meant nothing, because only a few dozen men could fight at the front at any given moment. He could not starve the Greeks out. His own supply lines were more fragile than theirs. He could not go around them by sea. The Greek fleet at Artemisium was holding off his navy in brutal skirmishes that had already cost him dozens of ships. He had 2 options: turn back and admit defeat, or find another route. Turning back was unthinkable. He was the king of kings. He had crossed the Hellespont with the largest army ever assembled. Retreating from a few thousand Greeks would destroy his credibility, embolden every subject people in the empire, and invite rebellion from Egypt to Ionia. But finding another route seemed impossible. His scouts had explored the area for miles. Inland, the mountains were impossible for an army. The coastal route through the map was the only realistic option. As the second day dragged into afternoon, Xerxes sat on his throne and watched his soldiers die for nothing. And then, as the sun began descending toward the western horizon, a Greek man approached the Persian camp under a white flag. His name was Aphilas. Aphilas was a local, a Meal Greek who lived in one of the villages near Thermopylae. He was not a soldier, not a political figure, not anyone of consequence. He was a farmer who had grown up in these mountains and knew every trail, every path, every shortcut, and he had information he believed was worth a fortune. The Persian sentries brought him to Hydons, the commander of the immortals, who brought him directly to Xerxes. Ephaltes bowed low and spoke in broken Persian, supplemented by a translator. He knew a path, a mountain trail that wound up from the W Valley floor, traversed the ridgeline of Mount Tigalidros, and descended behind the Greek position near the village of Alpanoi. An army could use it slowly, carefully, in single file, but they could use it. He could guide them tonight if the king wished. Xerxes leaned forward. How well guarded is this path? Ephaltes hesitated. The Phocians, about 1,000, are camped along it, but if you move quietly in darkness, you might reach them before they can organize. Xerxes asked the question that mattered. If we take this path, can we get behind the Greeks? Yes, Lord. By dawn, you could be behind them. They would be surrounded. There was a long silence. Then Xerxes smiled for the first time in 2 days. He ordered Leonidas to take the immortals, all 10,000 of them, and follow this Greek traitor up the mountain path. March through the night, reach the far side by dawn. When the sun rises, Xerxes would launch another frontal assault on the pass, and the Greeks would be caught between two armies. Leonidas saluted and left to prepare his men. Xerxes gave a purse of gold and a promise. When this was over, he would be rewarded beyond imagination. Ephaltes took the gold, bowed again, and left the tent. His name would become synonymous with betrayal in the Greek language. The word Ephaltes would eventually mean nightmare. But that night, he was just a farmer who had made a deal. The immortals assembled after dark. 10,000 men moving in near silence. No torches, no shouting. Weapons wrapped in cloth to prevent clanking. They formed a column and began climbing. Ephaltes led the way, moving confidently, even in the darkness. He had walked this path 100 times. He knew where the trail narrowed, where loose stones could cause a stumble, where the footing was treacherous. Behind him, the immortals climbed in single file, each man keeping a hand on the shoulder of the man in front to avoid getting separated. The column stretched for miles, 10,000 men snaking up the mountain in the dark. The climb was steep. Men stumbled. A few fell and had to be helped up, but they kept moving hour after hour, ascending through pine forests and rocky outcrops. Above them, somewhere in the darkness, the Phocian sentries sat around dying campfires, unaware that an army was climbing toward them. The 1,000 Phocian hoplites had been camped on the Thermopylae path for 5 days. They had seen no movement, no threats, no reason for alarm. The battle was happening below them in the pass. Up here, there was nothing but wind, trees, and silence. Most of them were asleep. Few sentries stayed awake, but they were watching the wrong direction, looking down toward the pass, not up the trail from the north. They heard nothing. The forest was dense enough to muffle sound. The immortals moved slowly, carefully, and knew exactly where the ocean camp was. He led the column on a route that would bring them past it, not through it. By the middle of the night, the immortals had climbed above the Phocian position and were continuing along the Regial line toward the descent on the far side. They were going to make it. The Phocians would wake up to find 10,000 Persian soldiers already behind the Greek lines, and down in the pass, Leonidas and his 300 Spartans were sleeping soundly, trusting that the mountain path was held. But just before dawn, something went wrong. A single sound in the darkness, barely audible, but enough. The rustling of 10,000 feet through fallen leaves. One of the Phocian sentries sat up listening and realized they were no longer alone. August 24th, 480 BC, the Phocian sentry grabbed his spear and shouted into the darkness. Within seconds, the camp erupted. Men rolled out of blankets, fumbling for weapons and armor in the pre-dawn blackness. Officers screamed orders. Someone kicked dirt over the campfires to hide their position. But it was too late for stealth. The immortals knew they had been detected. Hydaspes did not panic. He had 10,000 men. The Phocians had perhaps 1,000, most of whom were still half asleep and disorganized. He ordered his archers forward and gave a simple command: clear them. Arrows hissed through the trees. The Phocians raised shields, but they were not in formation. They were scattered across the camp in small clusters, trying to organize in the dark. Arrows found men still buckling armor, found men searching for helmets, found men who had grabbed their shields but not their spears. The Phocian commander, his name unrecorded by history, made a split-second decision that saved Persian time and cost Greek lives. He ordered his men to retreat uphill away from the trail to higher ground where they could form a proper defensive line. It was a tactically sound decision. Holding scattered positions in the dark would have been suicide, but it meant abandoning the path. The Phocians pulled back into the rocks above the trail, shields locked, spears ready. They could see the immortals now, thousands of them emerging from the forest below, like shadows, gaining form in the growing light. Hydaspes watched the Greeks retreat and understood immediately. They had given him the path. He did not pursue them up the rocks. Why waste time fighting when the objective was not to defeat the Phocians, but to get behind the Greeks in the pass? He ordered the immortals to keep moving. The entire column marched past the Phocian position just out of spear range and continued south along the ridgeline toward the descent. The Phocians stood on the high ground, watching an army 10 times their size walk past them in the dawn light, and understood with sickening clarity what they had failed to prevent. One of them, a young officer, broke from the line and sprinted downhill toward the pass. He ran like his life depended on it, because 10,000 lives depended on him reaching Leonidas before the immortals did. The descent from the ridgy line to the pass took over an hour, even at a dead sprint. The trail was steep, loose with stones, treacherous in the half-light. The runner fell twice, scrambled back to his feet, kept running. By the time he reached the valley floor, the sun was rising over the Malian Gulf, painting the water gold and red. He could see the Greek camp behind the wall. Men were awake, preparing for another day of fighting, cooking fires, the smell of bread, armor being strapped on. He ran toward the gate, gasping, legs screaming, and shouted for Leonidas. Guards grabbed him, thinking he was panicked or mad. He fought them off, still shouting, "The immortals! They're on the path. They're behind us." Leonidas appeared, calm, already armored. The runner collapsed at his feet and forced the words out between gasps. "The Persians, 10,000 on the Thermopylae path. They'll be at Elpenoi by mid-morning." There was a long silence. Every Greek within earshot understood what this meant. The defensive line at Thermopylae only worked if the pass was the only route. If the Persians were behind them, the position was worthless. Worse than worthless. It was a trap. Leonidas looked at the runner, then at his officers, then north toward the Persian camp, where Xerxes would soon learn that his immortals had succeeded. He asked one question: "How long do we have?" The runner shook his head. "They were all ready. Past the Phocians when I left. 2 hours, maybe 3. Leonidas nodded. Then he called for a council. The leaders of every Greek contingent gathered behind the wall. Leonidas stood at the center. No one spoke for a long moment. They were waiting for him to say what they were all thinking. He did not waste words. "The Persians will be behind us by noon. We cannot defend this position from both sides. Anyone who leaves now can reach the isthmus before the Persians catch them." The implication was clear. This was not a discussion about whether to retreat, it was permission to leave. Several commanders responded immediately. The Corinthians wanted to withdraw. So did the Phaeacians, the Mycenaeans, the Arcadians. They were willing to fight, but not to die in a position that no longer had strategic value. Leonidas did not argue. He had bought 2 days. That was what he came here to do. Athens had evacuated its population. The Peloponnesian cities were fortifying the isthmus. The delay had worked. He gave the order, "Go now. Get your men south before the Persians block the road." Most of the Greek contingents began packing immediately. Within 30 minutes, 4,000 men were marching south, moving fast, abandoning the pass before the trap closed. But not everyone left. The Thespians, all 700 of them, refused. Their commander Thermopylae stood in front of Leonidas and said simply, "We came to fight. Nothing has changed." Thespe was directly in the Persian path. If Leonidas failed here, their city burned anyway. Retreating only delayed the inevitable. At least here, their deaths would mean something. The Theons, those 400 whose loyalty had always been suspect, also stayed. Some sources claim they were held as hostages to ensure their city's cooperation. Others say they chose to remain. Either way, they did not leave. And of course, the Spartans stayed, all 300 of them. Leonidas sent away the Persiakoi, the non-citizen Spartans who had marched north with him. He kept only the 300 Spartiates, the men who had been selected specifically because they had sons. He was not keeping soldiers. He was keeping sacrifices. There was no strategic reason for Leonidas to stay. The pass was lost. The defensive position was compromised. Every military principle said, retreat, regroup, fight another day. But Leonidas understood something the other Greeks did not. If he retreated, the story would be the Spartans ran. When it mattered most, when the Persians found a way around, the Spartans abandoned the position and fled south with everyone else. That story would destroy Greek morale. It would validate every city-state's fear that resistance was pointless. It would make Xerxes seem invincible, and Greek courage seem like performance theater that collapsed the moment real danger appeared. But if he stayed, if he and his 300 Spartans held the pass, even knowing they would die, the story would be different. It would be the Spartans stayed. They knew they were surrounded. They knew they would die. They stayed anyway and fought to the last man. That story would ignite Greece. It would prove that Greeks could face the Persians without flinching. That death was preferable to submission. That Sparta, whatever its flaws, produced men who did not know how to retreat. Leonidas was not trying to win the battle. He was writing a legend that would outlive him, and every Spartan standing beside him understood this. One of them, Megistus, a seer who had accompanied the army, tried to leave. Leonidas ordered him to go, told him his death here served no purpose. Megistus refused. He sent his son away instead, then returned to the line. Another Spartiate, Aristomus, was suffering from a severe eye infection, painful, disabling, potentially blinding. Leonidas ordered him evacuated with the other wounded. Aristomus obeyed. He would survive and spend the rest of his life wishing he had died. By mid-morning, the immortals completed their descent and reached the village of Alpanoi to land. 2 miles behind the Greek position, Hydarnes sent a messenger to Xerxes. The path is secure. The Greeks are surrounded. Xerxes received the news in his command tent and reportedly smiled for the second time since arriving at Thermopylae. He gave orders for a coordinated assault. The immortals would attack from the south, pushing the Greeks back toward the pass. The main Persian force would assault from the north. The Greeks would be crushed between them. It would be over by noon. He sent one final message to Leonidas, delivered by herald under a white flag. You fought well. Surrender now, and I will spare you and your men. You will live as honored soldiers in my service. The herald rode to the Greek position and shouted the offer. Leonidas, standing on the wall with his 300 Spartans, the 700 Thespians, and the 400 Theons, did not respond immediately. He looked at his men. Most of them were in their 30s or 40s, veterans of a dozen battles, fathers, property owners. They had lives worth living, and every single one of them had known since yesterday that they were not going home. Leonidas turned to the herald and gave his answer. "Tell your king we will fight in the shade." The herald returned to Xerxes and delivered the reply. The King of Kings nodded slowly. Then he gave the order to attack from both sides. The last stand of the 300 Spartans was about to begin, and this time there would be no rotation, no rest, no retreat, just bronze and blood, and men who had chosen to die on their feet. The immortals struck first from the south. They came in formation, disciplined and silent, shields raised. The Thespians pivoted to meet them, forming a defensive line behind what remained of the southern wall. From the north, Xerxes unleashed every available unit, wave after wave, crashing toward the rebuilt wall where the Spartans stood. For the first time, the Greeks were fighting on two fronts. The Theons, positioned between the Spartans and Thespians, held for less than 10 minutes. When the immortals closed to within 50 feet, the Theon commander raised his hands. His men dropped their shields and walked forward with empty palms, raised in surrender. Hydanes ordered his men to seize them. The Thebans were bound and branded with the royal mark, living proof that some Greeks knew when to submit. Later, Xerxes would use them as propaganda. But for now, they were simply removed from the battlefield. 400 Theons surrendered without killing a single Persian. The Spartans and Thespians did not acknowledge their departure. There was no time. The immortals advanced into the gap the Theons had left behind. The Greeks were now fighting in two directions simultaneously. The Thespians held the south, shields locked, spears thrusting into the advancing immortals. They fought with the desperation of men defending their homes because they were. Every hour they held here was another hour for their families to flee. The Spartans held the north, facing the main Persian force, but the numbers were finally overwhelming. The Persians pushed forward in relentless waves, climbing over their own dead, using sheer mass to press against the Greek line. Shields buckled under the pressure. Spears snapped. Men stumbled. Leonidas made the decision before the line broke entirely. Back to the hill. The order was not panic, it was tactical. The wall was no longer defensible. Staying there meant being surrounded and butchered in place. Behind the wall, perhaps 200 yards back, was a small hillock, a raised mound barely 20 feet high, just wide enough for a few hundred men to form a circle. The Greeks retreated in formation, shields facing outward, moving step by step. The Persians pursued, but cautiously, wary of another feigned retreat, turning into an ambush. The Spartans and Thespians reached the hillock and climbed it, forming a defensive ring. 1,000 men now surrounded by over 100,000. The Persians did not charge immediately. They encircled the hill, tightening the ring, waiting for orders. Xerxes himself rode forward on horseback, close enough to see the Greeks clearly. He wanted to watch. The Persians attacked from all sides. They surged up the slope, and the Greeks met them with spears, stabbing down into faces, throats, chests. The height advantage made every thrust more effective. Bodies rolled back down the hill. But spears are wooden, and wood breaks. One by one, the Greek spears shattered. The shaft snapped under the strain of constant stabbing or splintered when Persians grabbed them and yanked. Within minutes, half. The Greeks were fighting with broken stubs of wood, still jabbing with the iron points, using them like daggers. Others dropped their spears entirely and drew their swords, short, brutal Zyos blades designed for close combat. The fighting turned intimate. Greeks and Persians grappled on the slope, wrestling for position, stabbing at unprotected flesh. Ah! Spartan drove his sword under a Persian's chin. A Persian archer too close to use his bow swung it like a club and cracked a Thespian's skull. Men slipped on blood and were trampled. The Greeks were being whittled down. 20 dead, 50, 100, and then Leonidas fell. No one knows who killed him. A spear thrust from below caught him in the side, slipping between his breastplate and hip-yard. He staggered, caught himself on one knee, and kept fighting. Another blow, a sword or axe, struck his helmet, splitting the bronze. He dropped his shield. The Spartans around him closed ranks, dragging him back toward the center of the circle, but he was already dying. Blood soaked his red cloak, making it darker, heavier. A Persian officer saw the Greeks protecting someone and understood. That was the Spartan king. He shouted orders. Dozens of Persians concentrated on that section of the line, trying to break through, trying to reach Leonidas. The Spartans held them. Leonidas died on the hillock, surrounded by his men, still gripping his sword. And the moment his body hit the ground, the battle became something else entirely. In Greek culture, leaving a king's body on the battlefield was unthinkable. It was desecration, dishonor, a stain on every man who survived. The Spartans would not allow it. They formed a circle around Leonidas's corpse, shields facing outward, and fought with a ferocity. And that shocked even the immortals. The Persians wanted the body for the opposite reason, to display it, to prove that even Sparta's king was mortal, to break Greek morale. For nearly an hour, the battle concentrated on a single point. Greeks and Persians died in piles, trying to claim or defend a dead man. Herodotus, the Greek historian who documented this battle, claims that 400 Persians died in this phase alone. Whether that number is accurate or exaggerated does not change the reality. The Greeks made the Persians pay for every inch. But there were too many Persians and too few Greeks. The circle tightened, then collapsed. By early afternoon, the Greeks were down to fewer than 100 men. Most had lost their swords. They fought with their hands, with rocks, with anything they could grab. Some used broken shields as clubs. Others tackled Persians and dragged them down, choking them with bare hands. Xerxes, watching from his command position, gave a final order. Stop sending men forward. Use archers. The Persian infantry pulled back, opening a clear line of fire. Thousands of archers formed a semicircle around the base of the hill and drew their bows. The Greeks, exhausted, bleeding, half-blind from sweat and blood, saw what was about to happen. They did not run. They did not beg. They stood in a loose cluster on the hillock, supporting each other, and waited. The archers released. The sky turned black. Arrows fell like rain. The first volley killed dozens. The second volley killed more. The third found men already dying, pinning them to the earth. A few Greeks tried to raise their broken shields. Others simply stood and let the arrows come. It took 4 volleys. When the archers finally stopped, the hillock was silent. 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians dead. The Persian army moved past the hillock without ceremony. They had a schedule to keep. Athens was still a week's march south, and Xerxes wanted to burn it before the Greeks could organize another defense. Engineers began clearing the pass, dragging Greek and Persian bodies aside to make room for wagons and supply trains. The rebuilt wall was torn down completely. The road south was open. Within 2 days, the Persian army would reach Athens and find it abandoned, evacuated on theistically orders. Xerxes would burn the Acropolis, the temples, the homes. He would stand in the ruins and declare victory. But he had spent 3 days at Thermopylae. 3 days the Greeks used to evacuate Athens. 3 days to position the fleet at Salamis. 3 days to fortify the Isthmus. 3 days to organize a resistance that would culminate in the naval battle at Salamis, where the Greek fleet would destroy a third of the Persian navy and forced Xerxes to retreat back to Asia. The 300 Spartans had not stopped the Persian invasion, but they had delayed it just long enough for Greece to survive. After the battle, the Persians searched the hill for Leonidas's body. They found it buried under corpses, Greeks and Persians alike. When Xerxes was informed, he gave an order that stunned his own commanders: decapitate the body and crucify the corpse. It was an act of desecration, a violation of all Greek and Persian burial customs. But Xerxes wanted to make an example. This is what happens to those who defy the King of Kings. The order backfired when word spread throughout Greece that Xerxes had mutilated Leonidas's corpse. It did not inspire fear, it inspired rage. Sparta's image transformed overnight. They were no longer the isolationist, militaristic oligarchy that other Greeks distrusted. They were the city that had sent its king to die so that Greece might live. After the Persians finally retreated from Greece following their defeat at Salamis and later at Plataea, the Greeks returned to Thermopylae. They found the bones, Greek and Persian, mixed together, impossible to separate after months of exposure. They buried them on the hillock and erected a stone marker. On it, they carved an epitaph written by the poet Cimon. It was only 2 lines. Oxane, go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. No boasting, no speeches, just a simple statement of fact. They had orders. They followed them. They died. 2005, 100 years later, the hill is still there. You can visit it. Archaeologists have found arrowheads, thousands of them buried in the soil. Persian and Greek bronze mixed together, corroded into fragments. They found bones, too. Not many. Most were moved or decayed, but enough to confirm that this place was real. That the battle happened exactly where the ancient sources said it did. The pass itself has changed. Centuries of silt deposition from the Spercheios River moved the coastline north. What was once a 50 feet wide choke point between mountain and sea is now over 3 miles inland. The battlefield is farmland now. Wheat grows where men died. Up the story survived. Every Greek school child learns about Thermopylae. Every Western military academy studies it. Every soldier in every army that claims to value, honor, and sacrifice knows the story of the 300, because Leonidas understood something fundamental. Battles are won or lost, but stories live forever. And the story he wrote on that hill in August 480 BC was this: some things are worth dying for. Freedom is one of them. And when the time comes, when the enemy is at the gate and the odds are impossible and retreat is the logical choice, there are still men who will say no, who will plant their feet, raise their shields, and make the enemy pay for every inch. Not because they think they can win, but because someone has to stand. Somewhere in Sparta, 300 women waited for husbands who would never return. They did not mourn like widows. They mourned like Spartans with pride. If this story moved you, leave a comment. Tell us why these 300 men still matter 2,500 years later. And if you want more history that hits this hard, subscribe, because there are 1,000 more battles, 1,000 more last stands, and 1,000 more stories of people who refuse to break. This is Dark History Class, and we're just getting started.